Hi, and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's third event for Hilary Term. We're here with Professor Paul Pietroski, who is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science at Rutgers University. And we're going to be talking about internalist semantics and individualism. So we're very happy to have you here.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
So a lot of your work has been about individualism and sort of against what Chomsky's called e-language, external and extensional. Presumably this goes hand in hand with internalism. Would you be able to spell out the core notion of I-language behind all of this work?
Yeah, good. So in principle, the distinctions are separate, though you're right. The being an I-language theorist and an internalist, in fact, I think hang together. But in principle, they're separate. So for Chomsky, the I-language, E-language distinction is simply the distinction between languages thought of as procedures of some kind. So either programs or biologically implemented procedures in our heads that generate expressions versus languages in any other sense. Though you say, well, what other sense might there be? Well, famously, it might be, you might think of languages as just like a set of expressions. So for invented languages, it's very common to think of the language as a set of expressions that we specify via some procedure that you might specify the same set in many different ways. Kind of echoing language Alonzo Church had developed in the late 30s, early 40s when he was thinking about Turing and computation. Church had distinguished what he called functions in intension, computational procedures, from functions in extension. And Chomsky's kind of echoing that terminology by saying, well, look, one thing we can try to study when we're studying languages like English and Japanese and Navajo are procedures implemented in human heads that somehow generate the expressions. Or David Lewis would say, no, I just wanted to just talk about the sets of the expressions. So I certainly follow Chomsky in thinking that, at least for purposes of cognitive science, the targets of inquiry are these computational procedures that humans somehow implement. But then I does kind of connote individual and internal, because it's then very tempting to think, well, look, I guess if the target of inquiry is the procedure, it's probably the procedures inside particular heads. And there could be individual differences. So if I'm a cognitive scientist, I might want to study the procedure that you use to generate expressions of English and hope that my procedure is more or less similar, but in principle, there could be differences to discover. And then, as Chomsky suggested, and I've tried to then pursue and develop, now when you start thinking about what the expressions themselves are, and in particular what pronunciations are and what meanings are, you might think, well, maybe we should be going internalist there too. Maybe I should be thinking about the procedures that we're talking about as procedures that pair pronunciations with meanings, taking meanings to be themselves things that are in the relevant sense inside the head. And what the procedures are doing is pairing, as Chomsky puts it, pronunciations or instructions to my articulators and the interface with my auditory systems in various ways, with instructions that interface with my cognitive systems in ways that are far less understood. And so, yes, for me, the focus on I languages leads pretty naturally to then a kind of internalism about meaning itself, right? An idea completely anathema to somebody like David Lewis, who wants to say, no, we're just talking about sets of expressions, and the meanings of those expressions are themselves more sets of things that are out in the world we deal with.
So people like David Lewis sort of objected that what you're doing then is sort of moving from mental representation to mental representation, which is all symbol manipulation, and so really syntax. Do you think that's true of internalist semantics?
Well, that's certainly what David said, and he's absolutely right. What I was just never understood is why that was an objection. Look, I mean, when Tarski did his great work in logic and showing us how to have a semantics for an invented language, he introduced, it really was new at the time, a kind of technical use of the word semantics, according to which, unless you were interpreting the syntactic structures in terms of some independent domain, you weren't doing semantics. And that's absolutely fine as a technical use of semantics. And so Lewis then said, well, look, if you want to give semantics for English in Tarski sense, right? So you're actually going to pair the syntactic structures with truth conditions and something like the way Tarski did. Well, then, right, you've got to do more than just pair mental representations with mental representations. He in particular had a paper by Fodor and Katz and a book by Katz and Postal in mind. And they were talking about how to pair Chomsky-style syntactic structures with mental representations of a certain sort. And Lewis rightly said that is not semantics in Tarski's sense. I just never understood why the study of meaning for natural language had to be the study of semantics in Tarski's sense. So I, in one sense, totally agree with Lewis, but just never heard it as an objection, just heard it as a, yep, you could define semantics that way.
Right. So what these people kind of argued is that the way natural language semantics, if it's going to happen with logic, it's going to be sort of extensions and or concepts, and the concepts have extensions and that sort of thing. What do you think is wrong with these ideas then?
Yeah, so the various things need to separate out here. I mean, one thing to remember is there's a very, very old tradition going back through the medieval logicians and all the way back to Aristotle, where you thought, oh, no, you get to talk about natural logic and you get to talk about the way grammar is related to logic without going out into the world, right? We suppose that there's a kind of language of thought, right? This is not an idea new from Jerry Fodor. It's an idea that William Malachem had, right? Aristotle was talking about thoughts as, affectations of the soul, and that you were trying to, in some sense, understand how the grammatical structure of sentences like, say, Greek or Latin are related to mental representations. And, these people did a lot of really, really good logic. We now think of logic rightly as fully connected with notions like truth and connected with notions like function and extension, especially after Frege's great work. And so I agree entirely, right? If you want to think about logic, then, and I don't mean just like natural logic of human psychology, but logic and mathematics, right? Now we're out in externalist, truthy land. Don't confuse that with psychology. But when it comes to studying the meanings of the expressions we acquire naturally, now seems to me very much an empirical question. Is the right vocabulary for describing the meanings of the expressions we naturally acquire the vocabulary we use when we're doing logic and studying the foundations of arithmetic? Or is it a vocabulary that we develop by studying languages in the way Chomsky did? Now, that's my own inclination. And my own view is that, in fact, the idea that the Chomsky-style syntactic structures have truth conditions, or that the strings of words we call sentences of English, that those strings are somehow expressions that have truth conditions. My own view is this is a fantasy that philosophers invented for themselves sometime in roughly around the 1960s. There's a series of philosophers, all interestingly sort of related to Harvard one way or another. So Quine, Nelson Goodman, Donald Davidson, David Lewis. And, by the time we get to the late 60s, early 70s, it's the really exciting new idea that sentences of English have truth conditions, and we're going to do this thing. But, once upon a time, that was described as a bold conjecture. And I think Davidson was right to describe it that way. And I just think the bold conjecture is false. I don't think there was ever any reason to think it was true, in fact. And historically, I think when you go back and reread this, you realize there were a bunch of people who were generally skeptical about the idea of meaning and thought maybe what we can save is the idea of sentences having truth conditions. But if you weren't especially skeptical about the idea of meaning in the first place, the idea that the sentences of English not only had meanings, but they also had truth conditions. Well, now, it seems you want to ask the kinds of questions that people had been asking forever. Like, what is the truth condition for the sky is blue? How are we going to handle the fact that words like book can be used to talk about the things you can drop or the contents you can read? going right back to Wittgenstein and philosophical investigations, right? There was a pretty clear criticism of the idea that sentences of natural language had truth conditions. And so it's not so much that I think there are these like super fancy arguments against this idea, which is almost certainly true. I think of it more like we got duped a little bit in the late 60s and early 70s into supposing that sentences of English and Japanese and Navajo, that these were expressions that had truth conditions in the first place.
So as a quick aside, you mentioned Fodor as language of thought. Is there something left of the idea that natural language sentences might derive their semantics from the semantics of Middle East then, or not really?
Yeah, good, Ray. So that was certainly Fodor's view. That I'm a little skeptical of for reasons that Chomsky was articulating already in the early 60s. So to take one of his famous examples, right, John is eager to please means that John is eager to do some pleasing of us. It doesn't mean that John is eager that we please him, though John might be indeed so eager. Whereas John is easy to please works the other way. It's John is easy to please means something. It's easy for us to please John, not it's easy for John to please us. But now if it was John is ready to please, or the duck is ready to eat, suddenly the thing has gone ambiguous. And you can either have, with say the duck is ready to eat, the duck is either prepared to dine or the duck is fit for consumption. This phenomena that, and it's all over the place, that a string of words might have, say with eager to please, one meaning, not two. A string like easy to please has one meaning, but not two, but it's intuitively a structurally different meaning. And then a third string, ready to please, goes ambiguous. That phenomena, which is just everywhere once you start looking for it, that always just made me skeptical that there was going to be an easy, the meaning of a sentence is just the meaning of an associated sentence in the language of thought, because now we have the question, why is it that some sentences of English go with one sentence in the language of thought, and some sentences of English go with two sentences in the language of thought, and some with three? And I guess I think about a theory of meaning as something that like helps us get some grip on why it is I can understand a string of words in English in, let's say, one rather than two or two rather than three ways. And here I just think it's then very important to distinguish, as often this distinction gets run over in contemporary philosophy of mind and language. There's questions about the contents of thoughts. So I got these concepts in a Jerry Fodor style language of thought, let's say, and all those concepts have contents. They're related to the environment somehow. Super interesting question. How does that work? Like, who arranged for animals to have concepts that have contents, right? Brentano's question in many ways, right? So great, let's just do that. But that's a question that seems to be has nothing to do with linguistic meaning. That's a question we have to face for all sorts of animals. How do their mental representations relate to the world in some way that we want to talk about in terms of a content relation? Then we have this very special problem that we face with humans who have acquired this capacity to acquire languages that pair pronunciations with meanings. And it's tempting to say, all we do is pair pronunciation straight with mental representations to have contents. But I just think it's more complicated than that. I think we have this special faculty that pairs meanings with pronunciations, and then we also connect our meanings with concepts and Fodor-style languages of thought. And eviscerating the distinction between meanings and contents, I think, runs the risk of losing track of what's special about human cognition, and that I do not want to do.
So if meanings aren't these extensional, referential things, what are they?
Yeah, so I take a kind of cue from work in phonology that thinks of pronunciations as kinds of instructions that get executed by your vocal tract. So Morris Halley used to talk about, said, think of it like you've got a choreographic score that you're sending off to the dancers. And the dancers in this case are aspects of the vocal tract, and you create a pronunciation by shaping your vocal tract in a certain way in accord with these instructions, right? Now, not everybody in phonology would like to talk that way, but even if that turns out not to be right in phonology, and I'm not a phonologist, that was the model that really just like impressed me, that you could think about a linguistic expression, so to speak, on its sound side, literally as a kind of score that could get executed by a performer. And we know something about how the performance works with regard to the vocal tract. Chomsky had been long suggesting that it's like that on the meaning side. We just don't have any grip about what to say about the instructions. But if you believe that there are languages of thought, then it seems to me a very natural idea to explore is on the meaning side, what a linguistic expression is just another score. It's another set of instructions that get read by systems that say, oh, I see, you're telling me how to build a mental representation. And you see the meaning as a kind of architectural blueprint for how to build up a complex concept, or in the case of a full declarative sentence, a complete thought. And so that's really the idea I've been pursuing for a long while now, that we just think about the meaning as an instruction to build a concept, recognizing that that means you've got to have a pretty clear distinction between instructions and that which gets built, and that the relation might be one to many, so that in fact, an instruction might get executed in multiple ways in different contexts by different speakers. So just as an architect might have a blueprint for a house, and different builders might end up building houses that are all recognizably similar, but different in their details, that's roughly how I'm thinking it goes with us. The meaning gives you a blueprint for the concept, and how you execute that blueprint, well, that's going to depend on details of the context.
So it's clear that, you can have a concept of cats and running and whatnot. What about functional words like if, or the quantifiers and things like that?
Good.
Presumably they're special cases of some sort.
Well, yes and no. So in this book I wrote, it came out a couple of years ago, I was suggesting that as far as lexical meaning is concerned, quantifiers anyway, are just more cases of the same thing. I've got a word like every, and its meaning is basically an instruction to like, go get me in every concept. So just like I think of the meaning of the word, when you get down to the atomic expressions, I think in meanings is pretty simple. There's just the atomic lexical item just tells you, go get a concept from the relevant basket that you've built up as a speaker of the language. So I'm inclined to think when it comes to words like cat and book and democracy, there's probably not just one concept in the basket, but as far as the meaning is concerned, it's just go get one, and get one that'll work for the context at hand. I actually think with every, it's pretty much like that. You just go get yourself in every concept. Now, the interesting question is about what's the actual logical form that'll take us into details. The interest, I think, with words like every and then if, though if is, I think, a special nightmare. But when it comes to those words, I'm inclined to think the way forward is to put down our formal semantics tools and adopt the tools of the psycholinguist. So I have another side of my life doing experimental work with Jeff Lids at the University of Maryland, Justin Halberta, a vision scientist at Johns Hopkins University, and a series of wonderful graduate students we've had on this project over the years, to just now try by psycholinguistic and experimental methods, figure out how people understand words like most. And with a wonderful graduate student, Tyler Knowlton, at the moment, we're chasing down each, every, and all, and trying to figure out what exactly is the representational format for those words. How do they differ from each other? And there, I just think there's tons of interesting stuff to learn as a cognitive scientist. But I think it's more by way of thinking about the representations independent of language that quantifiers interact with. And it turns out, if we're right, quantifier meanings are pretty much tailored to engage with other cognitive capacities humans have for dealing with number representations that we share with pigeons and rats and all sorts of other. So I think those words are interesting because they give us opportunities to think about where does human language meet the rest of the mind that we share with other animals. For purposes of compositional semantics, I'm not sure they're all that interesting. If I've been staying away from because the details are just so hard. But to tell you the truth, at the end of the day, I'm tempted by the idea that lexically, the meaning of the word if is go fetch a concept that lets you conditionalize one thought on another. And that's it. And that all the interesting work that people like Tim Williamson and Kai van Fintel and my colleague Tony Gillies do, I think, and Bob Stallmaker, my thesis supervisor, and David Lewis's, I think that's all fantastically interesting work about the contents of particular concepts. And that meaning-wise, I suspect at the end of it, all if is doing is just saying, conditionalize one thought on another. And the action is going to be in terms of the concepts that actually let us do that. And so I think here's a case where it's just really is important to distinguish lexical meaning from conceptual content. Though other people will say, you're just making it easy on yourself, Paul. You're making lexical meaning super easy and sending the problems over other branches of cognitive science, which I'll say that's right, because I got enough to worry about as a compositional semanticist, figuring out how words go together.
So yeah, you've mentioned compositionality a lot there. How does that fit into this whole thing fairly neatly, it sounds like?
Yeah. So the first thing I think to know about debates about compositionality is that as semanticists use that word, it really has almost nothing to do with composition. So if we take like a super simple case, so we just got a sentence like, say, Fido barked, and somebody says, geez, how is it the meaning of Fido barked depends on the meaning of Fido and the meaning of barked and how you put it together? A kind of standard answer you'll get is, well, let's think of Fido as a name for a certain dog, and barked is a name for a certain function that maps entities onto truth values, just in case those entities are dogs. So map to true if it's a dog and false otherwise. And you say, so if I got this right, the reason the meaning of Fido barked depends on the meaning of Fido and the meaning of barked is that the meaning of barked is that which takes the meaning of Fido onto the meaning of Fido barked. And people say, well, yes, sort of, but at least it's compositional. You say, well, hang on. What you mean by compositional is not that the truth value of Fido barked is built up out of Fido and the function. All you mean is that the function maps Fido onto the truth value. So what you mean is you're saying the sentences have truth conditions that are recursively specifiable. But recursive specification does not require composition in any interesting sense. It just requires recursive specification. And so I think a lot of people in semantics would say, well, actually, that's right. Semantic compositionality is not about compositionality of meanings. It's just about the sort of thing Tarski showed us how to do with theories of truth, right? Go look at Tarski semantics for the first order logic. It's not in any interesting sense compositional. It just shows you how to assign truth conditions to the sentences in a recursively specified way. Not that there's anything wrong with that, right? That was a great thing to do. I'm inclined to think that notion of just there should be some semantic property of the sentence that's recursively specifiable in terms of semantic properties of the components. It's like, I think like almost certainly has to be right at some level, but it just seems to me that's such a weak claim. It's the interesting question is, in what sense, in what substantive way are languages like spoken English and spoken Japanese compositional? And here, I'm inclined to think the medieval logicians had a real insight that is in danger of getting lost, right? The medieval logicians together, like not any particular one, but like taken as a whole, right? They had this insight, which I sometimes summarize under the slogan, other things equal longer is stronger, right? The expression brown cat is more restrictive than the word cat. Or at the level of concepts, the concept of being brown and a cat is more restrictive than the concept of just being a cat. And on the whole, though there are exceptions, words like or, not, and your favorite if. But if you hold aside some of those exceptions, on the whole, as sentences get longer, they say more. which invites the idea, I think, that we should be looking for a notion of compositionality according to which, as you build up meaningful expressions and keep adding clauses, what you're doing is making ever more restrictive expressions. That idea underlies almost all event semantics. So when you say the dog chased the cat, it's something happened. Let me tell you about it. It was a chasing, and the dog did it, and it happened to the cat. And one is used to this these days. Logical forms have ampersands all over the place. Why? Compositionality, as it's usually described in semantic textbooks, makes no prediction that there should be all these ampersands. Mere recursive specification does not require that the specification is in terms of ampersands, ands, conjoining, ever getting stronger. And so I think what we've got to do is look empirically at the notion of compositionality and ask, in what ways are meanings of expressions getting together to make complicated ones where it really is true, I think. The meaning of an complex expression is built of the meanings of the parts. And so one of the things I like about this idea of thinking about meanings as instructions is it provides a very easy way to talk about a complex instruction having other instructions literally as parts. And if some of the parts are literally conjoiners, then it becomes easy to think how a three-part instruction, get a concept of brown, get a concept of cat, and conjoin them, can give you something where you actually, okay, now I got it. The concept, the meaning of brown cat literally has the meaning of brown and cat as parts. And now we can talk about genuine compositionality. Though spelling out the details, of course, is very hard. But I think that's the way forward. It's to think, so to speak, more from the bottom up. How are the things going together, as opposed to just asking, can I, at the end of the day, from top down, provide a certain kind of recursive specification? I just think that's just too easy and too uninteresting about in terms of describing what the kids are doing.
So the concept builder that these instructions are fed into, what kind of theory do you envisage for that itself? Does it operate in a relatively restricted way?
Yeah, good. So this book that came out a couple of years ago called Conjoining Meanings, right? What I try to do there is start with the dumbest possible idea that had a prayer of being right and seeing how far you could go with it. And it turned out, I think you can go as far as everything we do in the first semantics class anyway. So my aim was basically to reconstruct everything that happens in the first semantics class that I was teaching my graduate students in linguistics at the University of Maryland out of standard textbooks. And what I wanted to do was ask, could you cover the same material with the following really, really dumb idea? The way the combinatorics works is this. There are two kinds of expressions. Not endlessly many kinds, nothing about entities and truth. There are two kinds of expressions. One that the medieval logicians would have just loved, the type of a monadic predicate. So think like words like brown and cow. Two, the idea of a dyadic relational notion. So think things like from, under, and crucially for event analyses, things like agent of, patient of. So a thing that would let you a space of concepts that includes both one thing is spatially related to another, but also that one thing, an entity, is related by an agent or patient relation to an event. So if you gave yourself the resources to have a lot of one-place concepts, brown, cow, and so on, and a bunch of two-place concepts, and now a little tiny analog of existential closure, so that what you can do is when you stick agent of together with cow, you get yourself a concept of an event in which a cow is the agent. And now go to work. See if what you can do, given theories of syntax that are like standard these days, could you show how to understand all the syntactic structures basically as instructions for how to build concepts that are fundamentally going to be very complex one-place concepts with a lot of ampersands in them, And down at the bottom, all you've got is one place and two place concepts. Now, I actually don't think that's rich enough to cover everything we see in natural language. What I was surprised by is how much you can cover in those terms. And what I tried to argue in the book is that interesting stuff keeps popping out if you pursue that project, and interesting stuff that seems empirically right, in my view. So, for example, like a really interesting question is, I think, why is it that the more we study natural languages, the more we find John gave Bill an apple? Initially, you might think give is three place, but the syntacticians go to work and say, no, it's really a two verb construction. And there's no single verb in there that's a three place verb. I think that's a general pattern. I don't know of any good evidence of natural language fronting up with honest to God three place, let alone four place verbs. Like, if that's true, like, I say, well, why does natural language traffic so much in one place and two place things? And so I was just exploring the dumb idea that, like, that's because universal grammar tells the child you're only allowed to traffic in one place and two place things, and then just see if that works out. So in addition to the general idea about thinking about meanings as instructions, I'm also tempted by the idea of starting by supposing the instructions are especially stupid, and then complicating on an as-need basis.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So you've just mentioned universal grammar. How much of this is going to be innately specified and universal?
So I'm pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool nativist. I've been, with help from very, very good psycholinguists like Steve Crane, who I initially started working with a long time ago. The more I just see what kids know by the age of 3, the more my jaw just drops. I don't see any alternative except to positing a really serious innate endowment. But that raises a question that Chomsky has been wrestling with at least since the early 90s. If you're a serious nativist, how do you, so to speak, minimize the innate endowment to make it seem not embarrassingly large, right? How do you, because this stuff has got to be genetically encoded somehow, or at least genetically supported. So part of my actually motivation in trying to keep the instructions dumb is that I can at least dimly envision a innate system that tells the child, look, we've been in biology and animal cognition doing one place and two place concepts for a long time, right? I'm guessing that languages of thought are evolutionary, very ancient. And so I'm thinking about the human language system as something that emerges, like, it's got to be less than 7 million years ago. That's our most recent ancestor with chimps. Could be as recently as like 250,000 years ago. Hard to say exactly, but it's some recent evolutionary innovation. And so what I'm thinking, hoping, is that what's innate on the side of meaning is a system that tells the child, look, we're going to pair these syntactic structures with a very restricted space of kinds of concepts you're already dealing with. So what the universal grammar on the side of meaning anyway is telling the child is, you got a complex mind out there. Let's aim these syntactic structures at a very restricted aspect to that mind. Now, that's going to have cascading consequences that turn out to be descriptively interesting. But my hope is that on the meaning side, we can keep the contributions of universal grammar very minimal. With my colleague and friend Norbert Hornstein, we've written a couple papers suggesting if you follow Chomsky in his attempt to keep the syntactic component of universal grammar minimal also, it turns out that the syntactic minimalism and the kind of semantic minimalism Norbert and I like kind of dovetail and take in each other's wash in a certain way. And so there's a hope that in another 50 years or so, people other than me will be able to say, yeah, there is a substantive innate endowment, but it's not so wild and woolly that we can't imagine it emerging by a relatively small tweak to primate cognition.
It's not going to be spitting out carburetor or something.
Sorry, say again?
It's not going to be spitting out carburetor.
Ah, good. No, right. So part of my wanting to keep meanings and conceptual contents separate is that my hope is that I don't need to posit anything new about conceptual contents, right? My sort of ideal picture is one in which the human infant is deploying the conceptual capacities available to any intelligent primate. And now the language system is just pushing them into pairing noises with those concepts in a certain way. Now, of course, once you've got language, then you can get pushed into acquiring concepts like carburetor. But that's like, so to speak, yeah, once we're talking and all sorts of interesting stuff is happening. But I'm like really hoping that something like on the order of 200,000 years ago, what there was a species of primate that was cognitively identical to its other primate cousins, except it had this tweak of human universal grammar, which on the concept side initially didn't do very much, except push the mind into acquiring words by pairing noises with 1- and 2-place concepts, and then with all the cascading consequences that brings. But now we're talking ambition, nothing I can like defend or plan to defend tomorrow.
Yeah, I suppose that yields us the sort of the old dictum of form with meaning as well.
Yeah, so I think there's tons of empirical evidence to suggest that Chomsky's initial intuitions here were right, that there's a very, very tight connection between meaning and syntactic form in natural languages, and that where you get the divergence, so where there are aspects of meaning that are not tracked by syntactic form, those are also the places where the study of meaning starts becoming less theoretically tractable and starts sliding over into, yeah, we use these expressions that have meanings in super interesting ways. And I don't really foresee any deep theories of how we use the expressions in the foreseeable future, and maybe not ever. It may be that our theories are always going to be limited to, here's what the meanings are and here's how they compose. How does an intelligent primate use these meanings in conversation? We just may be in a completely different theoretical space at that point.
So are you thinking of things like idioms there?
Well, no, like idioms, I'm thinking like would be like relatively easy. I'm worrying more about like, I got a sentence like, you will go to Europe, and now one person is a fortune teller using it to make a prediction. Somebody else is using it to make an order. General telling a private where they're going next. So you sort of Grice, Austin kind of point, and then launching beyond that. So beyond the stuff where Austin was already talking about. So yes, there are these form meaning relations, but then there's the conditions in which you use these expressions to perform various speech acts. And once the speech acts get interesting, like, so we're not just assertions about the weather, but like trying to like tell each other what we think and like how things are in the world. Now I just feel like you're into what happens if you had an intelligent primate, you gave them a language faculty, and then you let them loose to just start and think. And now I feel like as a cognitive scientist, I have almost nothing to say about that.
Right. So do you still see there being an interface between the semantics and pragmatics somewhere, even if it's not sort of, we're not going to be able to make any scientifically interesting
so I actually think there are scientifically interesting things to find there. Right. So people like Gennaro Kirchia and Danny Fox, and then in other ways, people like Robin Karsten and Deirdre Wilson, right, have done lots and lots of super interesting work, I think, isolating aspects of pragmatics that are theoretically tractable, right? So, when I was a graduate student, it all seemed like, pragmatics was that like place where, like do intelligent things with your words. but once people start thinking about, well, look, there's cases and cases. And so to take, super simple contrast, the contrast between exclusive implicatures, right? So you can have cake or ice cream, and 3-year-olds know perfectly well what's being said to them. You can have one or the other, but not both. Versus Grice's example, the candidate having fine handwriting, and you're supposed to infer that this file should be thrown away. That second one is off in, okay, build in everything you know about the world, everything you know about letters of reference, application processes, and it's something we can do. But that I don't see as theoretically tractable. But the or stuff really is. And it's tightly tied to form in ways I think that, with work from Kierke and Fox and others, lets you see that, oh yeah, if you've got a notion of meaning as compositional, now we could say, okay, how do you take the meaning and go one step farther into what you think of as computing the computable pragmatics? We're used to this idea in vision theory, right? First, you take the retinal images and give yourself a little sketch of what's going on, then apply another process, take yourself a step farther. So there's tons, I think, to be done going beyond the kinds of meanings I'm talking about. And now ask, and what are the next steps people would take by way of starting to flesh out and build up conceptual representations? And then at some point, it just goes off into Griceland, like really candidate has fine handwriting stuff. How much there is in between there, right? That we just have to discover. But I'm actually quite optimistic that there's going to be lots of post-semantic, but before all hell breaks loose, cognitive stuff to understand. There are people like doing great work, Kemla and their group, right, showing how to tie this stuff to experimental methods. This is like super exciting time to be thinking about those kinds of issues.
So is that for more or less a sort of first law of non-existence of cognitive science kind of thing?
Yeah. So, so I grew up with Fodor's Modularity of Mind, which has the really optimistic, if it's a module, you can get your roll up your sleeves and get a theory of it. And when it turns into genuine thought, give up. And I still do think there's something right about that, but I also think we're seeing there are lots of mid-levels. So places where one module meets another, or places where modules meet what Fodor would have thought is the central processor, the meeting points often, I think, turn out to be tractable. So this work on quantification that I do with Lids and Alberta and the graduate students who do the real work, those are issues about where does grammar meet other aspects of primate, or actually generally animal cognition, that we know about from work from people like Stan DeHaan and Randy Gallistel and Sue Carey. And if you can identify the interfaces, then you can start to work out from any particular module. Now, when you get way past the interface, you may be into Fodor's land of it's a dark night of the soul and there's nothing to be said. But I'm just way more optimistic than I used to be about the chances for progress within my lifetime at the interfaces. And this too is an idea that I think Chomsky's been pushing for a long while, that you really can make progress in cognitive science by identifying a particular system that you can study in detail, and then using that as a leverage to push out and ask it, how does that system interface with others? You might be able to learn something about the other side by understanding one side really well. This is also an idea that my friend and colleague Mark Baker in linguistics has been pushing for a long while. You might be able to understand what thematic relations and that end of cognition by starting from the grammar and pushing out. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in pragmatics. We're learning something about how grammar interfaces with cognition by starting with grammar and pushing out.
So I think we're coming towards the end. Chomsky's suggested, almost in passing, that maybe there is no sort of semantics in the traditional sense. There's a syntax component, a pragmatics component, and where they're interfaces. And presumably you're thinking that it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yes, But this actually connects back up with like one of the very first things you asked. So when Chomsky says that sort of thing, there's might not be any semantics for natural language. And Jerry Fodor used to sometimes say that sort of thing too. There's a sense in which what Chomsky anyway is doing is saying, look, I'll concede the word semantics to you, David Lewis. If you want to use semantics to mean what Tarski gave us, a truth theoretic semantics for an independently specified syntax, there might not be one of those for natural language. The thing I would stress, and that Chomsky also stresses on some days of the week, is let's not confuse that for saying there won't be a theory of meaning for natural language. If you stipulate that a theory of meaning has to be a semantics, well, then game over. But I think part of what Chomsky and I too would want to do is say, if you want to use semantics as a technical term, meaning you pair the strings with truth conditions, then it's an empirical question whether English has a semantics, even if we all agree English expressions have meanings that compose in some sense. Or put a different way, is a theory of meaning going to be a semantics in the technical sense? Now, there's another way of using semantics, much older, goes back to the 19th century, pre-Tarski, which is like, oh, by semantics, we just mean theory of meaning. So of course, natural language has a semantics. And I think this is part of how people got duped in the late 60s, early 70s, right? They just used semantics in two ways and weren't clear about it. Because if you start out on Monday saying, look, obviously expressions have meanings. I don't know what Quine was talking about, no meanings, right? Of course expressions have meanings. So of course there's a semantics for natural language. You just have to find out what it is. Then on Tuesday, somebody tells you, well, by semantics, what we mean is what Tarski meant. And now you're into, well, of course there must be a truth theoretic semantics for, and that slide, I think, is what Chomsky and I too would really want to resist. No fair using semantics to just mean theory of meaning, and using semantics to mean it's got to be truth theoretic. One of the things we just might discover is that the relation between meaning and truth is way more complicated than many of us were taught when we were students.
So just to round off, I think we've already touched on this, but the traditional denotational truth theoretic kind of semantics, is that still appropriate for mental representations sort of to court, as long as we're not talking about linguistic ones?
That's a great question, right? So, Hartree-Field had a classic paper asking these questions in the early 70s, right? Jerry Fodor in his ways tried to defend something like that. There's all the work on naturalistic theories of content from people like Fritz Millikan and Fred Dretsky and all sorts of other people. Yeah, about that I just don't have any strong views. My guess is that animal cognition involves many languages of thought, that there's just not a single one of them. And there's just going to be hard work sorting out for the various languages of thought, how they are and aren't related to the environment. But as an idealization, saying, look, let's imagine a language of thought that has something like a classical denotational semantics, that's a perfectly fine idealization to run with. And in fact, I'm even happy to run with that as an idealization for natural languages for purposes of teaching the first semantics class. So it's not like I want to say life was more complicated than we thought, so throw out the textbooks. If you think the meaning of a sentence is an instruction to build a concept, you can say for teaching purposes, let's adopt the very, very simple idealization. The instruction for any lexical item is go fetch this concept. There's only one of them. And let's pretend that that concept has an extension.
All right.
So let's imagine, if you like, a very, very limited tunnel vision line that has exactly one way of executing the instruction, and its concepts are all super clean. Then you can see truth theoretic semantics as, if you like, a byproduct of that idealization. And that's roughly how I teach intro to semantics, right? And you want the apparatus of that the logicians have given us for talking about this stuff. But then I think you also then want to say, as a cognitive scientist, good, now let's ask, how do you relax the idealization to make it realistic, which is, right, what I learned in my chemistry class. You start with the ideal gas law, and then you start thinking about how to relax the idealization that molecules are point masses that don't attract each other and that the containers are perfectly rigid. And that's, yeah, how does that actually work in the real world where the damn stuff has to be realized by the physics we know that's realizing it? But that doesn't mean you don't teach people the ideal gas law.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, I'm perfectly happy to run with this stuff as our simplifying picture about how thought is related to the world. And then if we add a simplifying thought about how language is related to thought, everything looks more or less the way we were taught. But it's, now 2120. It's, heading for 50 plus years after Davidson offered his bold conjecture. And okay, let's get past the ideal gas law and start heading for real chemistry.
So where do you see the sort of future of semantics going then? What are the interesting lines of research? You've mentioned a lot already.
Yeah. So to repeat too, I think thinking about the substantive ways in which natural languages are compositional, as opposed to just a super general description of recursively specifiable that applies to all the invented languages we can think about. So asking, as my teacher Jim Higginbotham would have put it, what's the empirical content of the compositionality thesis, right? That's, I think, one thing to think about. And then there are all these things about how do particular lexical items interface with aspects of cognition we share with our primate cousins, right? That's right. There's just tons to be done there. So we talked briefly about quantifiers, but for almost any subchunk of the vocabulary a 3-year-old could acquire, you could start asking questions like, geez, how are they pulling off pairing those words with the concepts they pair them with, right? Work by Lila Gleitman and John Truswell on acquisition of like the first 50 words. There's a whole venue there. And I would just add to that when Chomsky got this thing going in the 50s, he got it going formally by reminding or telling us, I guess, for the first time, look, recursion is not a one-size-fits-all thing. There are flavors of recursions, different kinds of machines that crank out endlessly many expressions. And the Chomsky hierarchy, which has now such a huge place in modern computational science, right, was a way of saying, here's just a whole range of kinds of computational power we know we can invent machines to exploit. Where do humans sit on that? What kinds of computational power does the child throw at the problem of pairing sounds with meanings? And I think semanticists have done way less of that than we could. So I think even if you don't want to go for my crazy idea that it's all like one place and two place predicates and it's ampersands everywhere, there's the general question of once we know we can invent languages like Church's lambda calculus and use them the way they get used in Lewis Montague style semantic theories. You look at it, right? That's a very, very powerful kind of computational power to be exploiting, as it were, as Church would have put it. Yeah, the power of a full Turing machine. And one of the things I think we can ask and should be asking as computational cognitive scientists is, like, what way less than that is a human child naturally deploying when they're acquiring? And this just gets back to, like, do we really want to think about languages as procedures inside the head as opposed to these e-languages? Because if we are going to think of them as the procedures inside the head, I take it you've got to ask the question, well, what kind of computational procedure is it? What kinds of resources are deployed? What kinds of memory resources? Like, where roughly on something like the Chomsky hierarchy does it sit? And this gave birth to a huge amount of exciting work in syntax in the 60s and 70s. And I think there's an opportunity for semanticists to do analogous kinds of work. I mean, it's like some of it's being done, but not explicitly in these terms. But I think it'd be just useful for the students to just do it explicitly in these terms and keep asking ourselves when we're teaching the intro semantics class, like, okay, what computational resources are we going to posit and what ones aren't we?
All right. I think that's it. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and it's been endlessly fascinating. Thanks so much for being.
Thanks very much. The questions were great, and I really enjoyed this.
I'm really glad. Thank you.
Thank you.